Hi, Mr. Sapora here, biology class, and get ready and strap in because if you thought your life was complicated, just wait till we crack into this sucker here. I'm talking about the cell. We're going to be doing cell cycle for the next couple weeks. Yeah. Okay. This unit can be complicated. There is some vocab, but I'm going to try and break this down and make this as simple as I possibly can and hopefully as interesting as I possibly can because it is some interesting stuff. So take good notes throughout this section. The homework assignments that I have for this ask you to summarize your notes. So have good notes so that you're able to do that. And let's just get this party started. Okay, so first off, here's an image. Maybe you've seen these before, floating in the water. I see them in the springtime. If you're a kid that's grown up around a pond or a lake and you've been out tromping around, I used to find these and thought they were weird. Still think they're kind of weird, but cool looking. And these are clusters of frog eggs. So frog eggs, fish eggs, frog eggs tend to be more on the surface and attached to something. Salamander eggs, amphibian eggs as well. Look similar. Okay, and when you look at these, you'll see this white kind of jelly coating around them, and that's actually the energy, the nutrient energy source for the developing organism, which is the dark spot in the middle. So what is going on inside here, though, when you see these? You see these little lines crossing them here, right? I have some other images here kind of showing you. Well, what's going on inside of here is that the cells are dividing. The cells are growing, and then they are dividing. I'm going to ask you a question later, but why aren't we made of just one big cell? Why doesn't this just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's just a giant, huge cell that we call frog? Why are big things made of a bunch of cells, not just a big cell? So the cells end up growing, but then through that growth process, they end up dividing. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this section here, especially this first week. Why do cells divide? And then how do they divide as well? Eventually, we all start out as one cell, and that cell divides, and then those two cells divide. So from 2 to 4, from 4 to 16, and then on exponentially until you get to big, beautiful organisms you see right here or right here. Okay, made of trillions of cells or millions. So some basic biology review. I want to go back and talk about those 6 characteristics of life again because it all ties into that, right? It all ties into that here on Earth. All living things here on Earth are made of, boom, you nailed it, cells. All living things are made of cells. I'm made of cells. This apple's made of cells. A humpback whale is made of cells, okay? Fungus, algae, bacteria, every living thing here on Earth is made of cells. And all cells also use and require, all living things use and require a source of in some form of energy. And we talked about this when we talked about ecology and photosynthesis, right? The producers and then the consumers, right? Producers produce their own energy, consumers consume energy. In order to stay alive, you need that source of energy. So energy and the competition for energy is really what drives ecosystems here on Earth. The ecosystems that are the richest here on Earth are the ones with the most energy, and the ones that are the least biodiverse, least biologically rich, are the ones that have issues with energy. Either not enough light or some of the other abiotic factors are off. So all living things are made of cells, and all cells need a source of energy to survive. And what controls the form and function of a cell? What is it that controls what a cell is and what a cell does? Well, that's the DNA. DNA inside the cells, inside the nucleus of the cell. You got the DNA, and that's shooting out little bits of RNA, right? DNA makes RNA, and then that's making all the proteins, which is making up all the little things you see inside the cell and controlling all of the jobs of the cell as well. Okay, all living things also blank and blank. Yeah, grow and reproduce. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this section on the cell cycle is about growth. Cells grow, and then they reproduce, right? So I can literally trace my lineage, and you can too. Every living thing here on Earth can trace its ancestry all the way back to the beginning of the first cells, right? Some 3.8 billion years ago. Because all living things grow and reproduce, and cells beget cells. So that's kind of cool. And during our lifetimes, we grow. Cells and living things also respond to their environment, either physically or chemically, mechanically or chemically. And cells homeostasis it up. They maintain a stable internal environment. And we're going to talk about that too. So that has to do with cell size. Cells need to maintain a stable internal environment. They need to get rid of waste. They need to take in nutrients. They need to have a certain type of chemistry in order for them to stay living and do their functions and jobs. Okay, so start taking notes here, please. All cells come from pre-existing cells. This is some cell basics here. And this statement, and I'll repeat it again, all cells come from pre-existing cells. This is one of the central sort of tenets of what's called cell theory, right? Cells don't just magically appear. Cells arise from cells dividing, boop, and then making two cells, and then those cells, boop, boop, keep dividing, and then you get all the cells that make up a body or reproduction, right? New cells, just ignore that line, put a line through that. I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Single-celled bacteria can reproduce in 20 minutes. So one way that cells beget cells, or new cells come about, is that cells will just divide their DNA up on the inside, and then they'll split in half, and that's asexual reproduction. That's cloning. So for single-celled organisms, they can do that, and they can do that really fast. For organisms like you and me, though, we are big, complicated, eukaryotic organisms, and we're multi-celled. We all started out as a single cell, and that single cell, all of us did, right? All of us started out as a single cell that you could fit hundreds of in just a drop of water. You couldn't even see it with your eye without a microscope, where you started. And then that cell divided and divided and divided and divided and kept on dividing until you get to the 37 trillion cells that make up you and me right now, give or take a few. So this is a really complicated process, and it's pretty cool, actually. We're going to learn about it. So fun fact, you're made up of 37 trillion cells, the average human is. And many of our cells are continually growing and dividing, and this is a process called growth, right? Growth is your cells getting bigger, but then it's also them multiplying and dividing, because cells can only get so big, and we'll talk about that. And you're made up of all kinds of different cells, too. There's hundreds of different cell types in the human body alone, and many, many different types of tissues. So you have brain cells, you have liver cells, you have muscle cells, you have blood cells, you have intestinal cells, you have antibodies, you have white blood cells. You have all kinds of different cell types, and not all of your neuron or nerve cells are the same. So your brain cells, there's even different types of those, and then there's different types of nerve cells. So we're incredibly complicated at this point, after 3.5 billion years of evolution. And we have all these different types of cell types, but we all still start out as one cell type. That original stem cell that then just keeps dividing and branching and then eventually segregating off into different cell types and tissue types as we grow. Cool stuff. Cool stuff. And it seems super complicated, but then when you look at it down here on this level, we are just this mess of cells. I find it pretty fascinating. So living things have a life cycle, and so do cells. The life cycle of an organism, like myself, or this whale, right, that involves birth, growth, getting bigger, development, right, so, and reproduction, and then eventually death. Okay, so that is the normal life cycle of any living thing here on Earth. And cells themselves have their own life cycles as well. Our own cells in our bodies have a life cycle that kind of mirrors that, because they're a living thing that's making up the bigger living thing. It's kind of cool. And that little life cycle of a cell is called the cell cycle. And that's what we're here to learn about today. Okay, the cell cycle is a regular pattern, right, of growth. So there it is. And birth, yes, and we'll talk about that. It's when cells divide, right? So a cell divides, and I guess that's birth. Whoever the original cell was would be the parent cell, and then you end up with what they call two daughter cells, but one of them is really the daughter cell. So cell divides, and then it's born, and then it grows, it gets bigger. And then the DNA duplicates inside of that cell as it gets ready to divide again, and then that cell will divide again. So that is the life cycle of a cell. The cell is kind of divided off, born, it grows, it gets bigger, its DNA duplicates, and then that cell here divides again, and on, and on, and on, and on, throughout your lifetime, until no more, right? But then the reproduction part takes care of that part of your species, at least, being carried on throughout time and not going extinct. Now, this process of the cell cycle occurs in eukaryotes, things with a nucleus. In prokaryotes like bacteria, it's a little simpler, and we're not going to get into that. We're going to focus on ourselves, plants, fungus, animals, plants, fungus, and protists for this part. Okay, so fun facts. Here's some of the different cells that we have in our body. And here's the different rates at which they grow and divide. Again, you started out as one single cell. And cell division happens fast early on in life, right? Babies grow and develop at a faster rate than, obviously, than adults do, hopefully. And so, but for the average human, a skin cell, those replace themselves about every 2 to 3 weeks. Your skin cells do out here. Your red blood cells, your blood cells, they get replaced about every 4 months, and they are manufactured in your bone marrow and in your spleen. And they last about 4 months, and then they wear out, and they themselves don't actually divide. They don't have a nucleus. Your liver cells, they last about 10 to 12 months, so about a year to a little over a year for your liver. Your lining of your intestines, they're only every 4 to 5 days. So those replace themselves really fast because that is a mucous membrane. And same thing with like the lining of your stomach and even your mouth and your esophagus, much like the lining of your intestines, that whole digestive tract, it replaces itself really rapidly. And this is one of the reasons that people with diseases like cancer, when they get chemotherapy, which attacks fast-dividing cells, it will attack these cells that divide 2 to 3 weeks, 4 to 5 days. It'll be attacking these as well, and that's why things like sores in the mouth, nausea, vomiting, trouble eating, problems with skin and fingernails and hair, and all of that. Now, on the other end, things like heart muscles, they will heart cells, they're muscle cells, that they'll last 40 years. So you might just replace those once in your lifetime, which is pretty crazy. And this is why things like heart attacks can be so serious and have lasting impacts, because if that tissue gets damaged or dies, it is not going to grow back. So that is one of the reasons that you want to treat a heart attack right away and don't sit on it. Okay, nerve cells, especially in your brain and in your spinal column, they can last an entire lifetime and never be replaced. And this is why things like spinal injuries can be so serious and cause lifetime paralysis and things like that as well. So we are all made up of all of these different types of cells, and they grow at different rates throughout our lifetime. A lot of who we are is made early on. A lot of our brain development happens early on in child development as well. And then some of the other parts of us around all of that add up and get replaced more frequently throughout our lifetime. But let's just take a look here at a person from a kind of diving in virtual microscope point of view, shall we? Okay, so we're looking at a person and we're looking at going into their mouth and into their esophagus, it looks like here, which will then, or their trachea actually, into their lungs. And let's zoom in. So now we're just looking at the basic, anatomy level. We can all see that. And now we're looking into, we're going to zoom in and we're going to take a look right here at the trachea, it looks like. So if we take a cross section, it's kind of weird, of this right here, right in here, and whoop, we look down at it, we can see that it's made of clusters of different types of cells, all kinds of different types of cells. There's cartilage in there. There are blood vessels in here. There are epithelia, which are little tiny mucousy cells that can move stuff around and secrete water. That's what makes your mouth not dry and your throat not dry. And then there's even muscle cells that expand and contract And if you've ever accidentally swallowed like something you hadn't chewed all the way, like a carrot, and it grabs it, and you get that feeling, that's those muscle cells working. I do that all the time. It's not very comfortable. Now we're going to zoom in and look right down at the cellular level. So we're going to look right down in here. We're going to look sideways at it now, like a cross cut. And you can see all of the different cells. These are the epithelial cells, the ones that are responsible for secreting out fluid and then moving things up and down. And then you've got some basal cells down in here below that, and then you've got your smooth muscle cells down in here, and even some nerve, and you'd get some blood vessels in there. Now we can zoom in on one of these cells. We'll just go right in here, take a look. Whoop! Now you're looking at a single cell, and it even has these little cilia, which are little proteins that stick out of it that help move stuff up and down your throat. So as you swallow, it moves stuff down, and if you get a bunch of junk in there, it moves stuff up and out, and that's phlegm. Gross. But this is what the cell is, and here's the nucleus, and then here's all the other cell parts around it, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi bodies, Golgi apparatus, and mitochondria, all of that stuff. Don't worry, we're not going to have to learn those in this unit. Okay, so we are all made up of cells, 37 trillion of these things, and we have hundreds of different types of cells throughout our body. We all start out as one, and then they keep dividing, and that DNA in there kind of tells, okay, you cells are going to do this, and you cells are going to do this now, and then it controls those specific genes that make those proteins in that part of it. Woo! A lot of information, but that's cool stuff. So again, our cells replace themselves at different rates, and there's that. So now let's talk about why cells divide in the first place. Why am I not just a mass of 5 or 6 or 100 or a dozen or one big cell? Why am I 37 trillion? That's excessive. That's a lot. Okay, so why don't cells just get bigger? Okay, it's a good question. We're going to find out why. So all of these build up. So one of the reasons is that cells require a constant supply of nutrients. Cells require oxygen. All of our cells do to some degree. Glucose and sugar, so energy, and then air, so they can do cellular respiration and produce energy for doing their cellular stuff. And they also need to get rid of waste. Carbon dioxide and other metabolic waste products as well. So cells require this constant back and forth of energy, nutrients, oxygen, getting rid of waste, energy, nutrients, oxygen, getting rid of waste. All the time. So cells have to have this constant back and forth. And in order to maintain homeostasis, that stable internal environment, in order to get rid of enough waste so that waste doesn't build up, so they don't build up with too much carbon dioxide, and so they have enough oxygen in and enough carbon dioxide going out so that it's a steady one in, one out, one in, one out. That's homeostasis, right? A stable internal environment. If I have a classroom of 30 kids, and for every kid going out to the bathroom, one comes back in, right? I'll maintain it at 30 or 29. But if 5 kids are leaving and one is coming back in, on average, within a few minutes, I'm going to have an empty classroom. And that's not homeostasis. That's not maintaining a stable environment. That's not stable. So same thing with cells. If one goes in, one comes out, that's that stable internal environment. So in order to maintain that, nutrients and waste are moving back and forth at a pretty high rate of speed in the cell to keep it functioning. And if there is a small surface area for materials to cross into and out of the cell may not be able to run effectively. In other words, it will choke. If there is a big area in the middle, but a kind of a small area on the outside comparatively, there was not enough room for enough stuff to get in and get all the way to the middle and then back out, and the cell will build up with waste and not enough nutrients will come in, and it'll eventually choke and bog down. And I got a little example of that I'm going to show you right here. So cell size is regulated by a surface area to volume ratio. Cells need a large surface area to volume. Once a cell gets too big, it needs to divide. So what are we talking about here? surface area to volume ratio. I have some graphics here. I'll show you on the right. So surface area to volume ratio on this graphic right here, you can see if you've got something small, like a tiny little cube, and I'll just write this out like this. So if I've got a tiny little cube here, and let's say it's 1 inch by 1 inch in size. Of course, with cells, we're talking things like nanometers or whatever. So we got a 1 by 1. And so surface area to volume, surface area is calculated as length times width times the number of sides. So length times width times the number of sides. And I've got, it's 1 inch high or long by 1 inch wide. And it's got how many sides? It's a cube, let's say, so 6 sides. So that's going to be 1 times 6. And that equals 6. So that would be our surface area on this one. Now, the volume is calculated as something different. So what's the volume of this? And by volume, I mean how much can we fit inside of it, right? So if we're doing centimeters here or whatever, we could do cubic centimeters for volume. How many centimeters cubed could you fit in there? Centimeter by centimeter by centimeter, little cubes, could you fit into that thing? And so for surface area to volume, we will do surface area to volume calculation is length times width times height on this one. So length times width times height on this one. And if it's a 1 centimeter cube, it's 1 times 1 times 1. 1 times 1 times 1. And that's going to equal, oh boy, this is tough math, 1. So the surface area to volume ratio is a 6 to 1. Surface area is 6, volume is a 1 ratio. Surface area is much higher, 6 times higher than the volume. So there's a lot more surface area than there is volume, right? 6 to 1, 6 times surface area to the volume. So in this situation, small is good. You've got more surface area. So if I've got a little bottle here like this, the amount I could fit in here compared to the amount of area on the outside, well, the amount I could fit in there is pretty small compared to the amount of area on the outside. So the surface area is really high on this. And if there's oxygen molecules that need to get through here to get to the middle of this thing, carbon dioxide needs to get out. They can move back and forth, and they have a lot of places to get to and move from all around it. Now, if I get something bigger, the surface area to volume ratio starts to change. So we'll go with something bigger here now. Let's go with a cube that is 4 centimeters instead of 1. And so that's 4 and 4 here. And 4 times 4, because it's length times width times height. Length times width times height. Kaboom on this one. 4 times 4, oh sorry, times sides. Sides. My bad. 4 times 4 times 6. 4 times 4 times 6. And that is, that's right, folks, 96. I did not do that in my head. I cheated, and I did this before. Why not? Now that's the surface area on this one, 96. Okay, now we're going to do the volume, and volume is length times width times height. Length times width times height. And now we're talking 4 times 4 times 4, and that equals 64. So our surface area is 96, and our volume, V down there, is 64. So the surface area to volume ratio of this one, right? It was 6 to 1 before. On this one, though, on this one, it is now 96 to 64, or 1.5 to 1. So what this is saying, 1.5 to 1, is that for the volume, for the surface area, there's only 1.5 times greater surface area to volume versus the 6 to 1 before. So it's a smaller surface area to volume. So, example. This little jar here, where oxygen and nutrients are going in and out, trying to get to the middle of this jar. Well, there's a lot of room all around here, and it's a small area in the middle so it can move back and forth. Now, if we get something bigger, all of a sudden it's more distance to the middle of this thing, and there's not as much surface area on it. Now, if we go real big, if you're something in the middle here, a tiny little thing, whatever's on the outside has a long ways to go to get to you, and there's a lot of volume in here, not as nearly as much surface area on this one. So the bigger you are, the more volume you have, the more you can carry on the inside, and the less surface area to volume you have. Cells run into a problem here. Once a cell gets too big, it can't maintain that homeostasis. It can't maintain that nutrient waste coming in and out. And it starts to choke. It starts to get bogged down. So the cell's solution to that is to divide. And cell size is regulated by this. So let's talk about how small cells are. We said that we're made of 37 trillion cells. Well, let's take a look and see how small cells are. So on the screen here is some examples of some things that are small. They're kind of blown up even, right? A grain of rice generally isn't this big, and a coffee bean usually isn't the size of an apple. So if we zoom in, though, and look down here, we got a grain of salt, a sesame seed, and then we're going to zoom in. This is the smallest single-celled thing on Earth. It's an amoeba. And these are single-celled organisms that live in water, and they can be kind of a problem. That's why we have water filters. But they're still incredibly small. You can see them with a magnifying glass, but that's as big as a cell can get. Beyond that, the surface area to volume gets too big. The volume gets too big of this organism, and it can't pass nutrients and waste back and forth at a fast enough rate, so it needs to divide again. Now, most cells are smaller than an amoeba. Here is a paramecium, which is a single-celled organism that also lives in water. And then a human egg. Everybody in this room or watching this video started out as a human egg. Again, so small that you need a microscope, right? You can barely see it here, and this is already magnified to even see it. And most of our body is made of cells even smaller than that. Here's an average skin cell right here, this pink one, a skin cell. You can see your skin, but you can't really see your skin cells. Well, how is that? I like to use the analogy that you can see the sand on a beach from an airplane. You can see the beach from an airplane, but you can't see the individual sand grains from an airplane. You have to go all the way down to the beach and get on your hands and knees and look down to see the sand grains. That's what a microscope is to your skin. We're at the airplane view, and in order to see the individual cells, we would need to get out of that plane and look down really close, and that's why we have microscopes. Without that, all you can see is that there's a beach way over there. That's your skin. Now, cells get even smaller than that, of course. Your blood cells are even tinier. And then a single chromosome right there. Now we're getting into yeast, which is a fungus, mitochondria, and then bacteria. Really super tiny. So there's E. coli as a bacteria. Mitochondria are inside your cells. 37 trillion of those make up you. Zoom in. There you are. Zoom out. There you are. So cell size is regulated by the ability for cells to get nutrients and energy in and out of them at a fast rate. And a cell this big, if this was a single cell, which is made up of many, many cells, wouldn't be able to get things in and out of it fast enough, and it would get bogged down and it would choke out. That's basically how I explain that. All right. So we're going to talk about some of the stages now of the cell cycle, and it has some vocab and some names with it. So far, we've kind of lived in the world of concepts, and now we're going to look at the actual process itself. So strap in for this. This is going to be a two-parter. I'm going to start on it this week, and we're going to finish it next week. So we're just going to go through the stages of the cell cycle, the first stage, and then I'll mention the last two today. So the first stage of the cell cycle is right where? Is right here. And the first stage is called interphase. And this is where a cell spends most of its life. This is where most of your cells spend their life doing is interphase. And their interphase gets broken up into 3 parts. So interphase is then broken up into 3 sections itself. G1 is the first part of the cell's life, and this is where the cell spends most of its time. It's where the cell grows, and that's where your cells do cell functioning stuff. It's where my skin cells behave like skin cells, right? They protect me from the environment, and when I get too hot, they'll let a little bit of sweat out. I don't know what else skin cells do. So this is where your cells spend most of their time. They're functioning as those types of cells. It's where your liver cells do liver functions, okay? It's where your heart muscles beat. And for cells that live a long time, like your heart muscles, 40 years, most of that is right in here. Interphase G1, what they would even call G0 for those types of cells. But it's that first part where they are just doing the functions. Now, as these cells begin to divide, as you grow, as they replace themselves, as they start to wear out, then the DNA is replicated, and that's what they call the S, or synthesis part of interphase. Okay, so interphase consists of 3 different small parts. So G1 is the first one, where just cells grow and then do normal cell stuff. S phase is synthesis, where the DNA is replicated and copied. And then the G2 is the last one, and this is where the cell, after the DNA has been copied, does some additional growth, gets bigger, and gets ready to split in half. Right? So that is the first stage of the cell cycle, interphase, where most of the cell's life is spent growing, functioning, and then synthesizing and getting bigger and getting ready to divide in half. G0, as I mentioned, you don't need to know this, don't write it down. Cells that rarely divide, such as your brain or nerve cells or heart cells, do the first part of G1 and then kind of enter this G0 phase where they just kind of hang there. They're not really interested in dividing, so they kind of go into just like operating status. We don't need to worry about that. Cells spend most of their life in this interphase area, right? This G1 synthesis and then getting larger, getting ready. This whole interphase part of a cell cycle is 23 out of 24 hours of the day. You want to think about it that way. Now, mitosis is something that we're going to spend a lot of time on next week. There's 4 steps to mitosis, and for some reason, it's important for you to learn those, as opposed to everything else. I'm not sure why, but it's an easy one. It's kind of a fun one, and so we'll learn these 4 stages of steps of this process next week. But for now, we just need to know that mitosis is a 4-step process where the nucleus of the cell divides inside the cell. So this is all happening inside the nucleus, right? Or in the cell. The nucleus divides, and then eventually we'll get to the next part. The cell will split in half. So mitosis, all of the DNA has been duplicated, and then the chromosomes line up, and then they basically line up, and then they divide and split so that each side of the cell gets the exact same amount of DNA, right? You got to have the exact same copies. So one side of the copies goes on the other, and the other side goes on the other, right? You have to have exactly the same DNA copies on each side. You can't be switching things up. Otherwise, the cell's not going to function. So mitosis happens down here. Cool little animation. I'm so good. Yes. And then the last and final stage of the cell cycle, the last and final stage. So the first stage is this interphase where cell spends most of its life. Your skin cells are just doing skin cell stuff. Interphase. They grow, and then they do skin functions. And then before they are about ready to die, the DNA divides inside the cell gets a little bigger, and then during mitosis, all the DNA separates in the cell, forming 2 new nucleuses. And then the last stage is called cytokinesis. Interphase, mitosis, and then lastly, cytokinesis. Cyto means cell, and to kinese means to divide. So the cell literally divides into 2. The cell then snaps in half, and you have 2 what are called daughter cells from that original parent cell. Which is weird because then it's like the parent becomes the daughter in one of them. Anyway, you end up with 2 genetically identical cells, because this is not reproduction, this is growth. So your DNA is your DNA. So this skin cell copies that skin cell, the DNA should be identical to those, and you make copies. You've done this at least 37 trillion times. Many more than that, because many of your cells replace themselves at a pretty fast clip. That's the cell cycle. And cytokinesis is small, and it happens right in here. Boop, and it's the last part. Interphase, mitosis, cytokinesis. That's the life of a cell. That's like birth, growth, development. You get married, right? You have some kids, you buy a house, and then at the end, I guess people get divorced. And you know, they start over again. This has been a long enough video. I'm gonna end on that. Okay, so I made a little table, and we'll get into this later, where you could kind of break these down. I know it seems complicated. There's some vocab in here, but just remember the concepts of what is happening. Don't get stuck in having to remember which one is which necessarily. If you can remember them in order as an interphase, mitosis, and then cytokinesis, everything else should kind of fall into place, right? G1, S, G2. G1 is where the cells grow and carry out normal functions, right? Just cell life. S is where the DNA is replicated. G2, it gets a little bigger, and then mitosis. We're going to get into the 4 stages of mitosis next week, and it's all we'll focus on is this prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase, and how that works. We'll look at some examples of that. But for now, I want you guys to fill out your cell notes, part 1. I ask you to review the 6 characteristics of life. So be sure to use the notes, not just what you Google and end up with some weird stuff in there. And then I have you guys look some stuff up. I have you summarize your notes for this. So this is a little more work than some of the other ones. But there's just some conceptual stuff I want you to get in here. Okay. So that is the notes assignment for this week. I have an extra credit question at the end. And thanks for hanging in there. That was fun. Cell cycle. Yeah. Later.